On December 19th, 2008, Sarah Montana's life was suddenly catapulted into darkness. Her mother and brother were murdered in cold blood. She spent her life since searching for the answer to forgiving her family's murderer, looking for the single most important key to moving on, to finally letting go. Today, she's an actress, an accomplished screenwriter for the Hallmark Channel, and her TED Talk and Goldcast Talks on forgiveness have touched millions of people across the globe. I'm Adina Stilerman, and I want to invite you to an exclusive conversation with Sarah Montana on forgiveness, because we all have something in our lives, or someone that we're challenged to forgive. And if she can do it, so can we. Are you ready to finally give yourself permission to let go? Hello, hello, everybody out there. Welcome to the long-awaited event brought to you by Olemi Sold, entitled Permission to Let Go. Some of you are part of the Sold community, and you're here tonight to connect to what you love about us, which is some great Jewish inspiration. And some of you are brand new to the community. So I want to welcome you with open arms. And believe it or not, I'm actually quite new to Sold myself. I just joined the team recently, so I'll start off by telling you a little bit about me. My name's Adina Stilerman. I'm a Miami gal. I love nature. I hate cooking. And I'm always looking for inspiration from any source around me. But this event tonight is really personal to me, because the subject of forgiveness is something that I've been interested in for a long time, and I have a feeling that I'm not alone. So when I was searching for the perfect person to discuss forgiveness tonight, I actually did a Google search, and the first person that popped up was none other than our guest speaker tonight, which was Sarah Montana. And she has this really popular TED Talk, but I thought, you know what, I want to give myself some options. I'll look around to see if there's anybody else that seems to be an expert in the subject of forgiveness. And wherever I turned, Sarah's face popped up. And I thought there must be something about this woman that she has made a reputation for herself. And then I watched her TED Talk. Now, I don't want to spoil the story for you, but what I will tell you is that her messages touched me very deeply. It touched me through the screen, through our religious differences, through our background differences. Somehow I felt like we had a big connection, a deep connection. So I reached out to her, and that's why she's coming on tonight. A little bit about Sarah is that she is a screenwriter for the Hallmark Channel. She's a writer, she's a public speaker, an actress, and she's won quite a few awards in her field of expertise. She's currently writing on her first memoir, which I'm really excited to come out. Now, I think what makes Sarah so unique and so special is not her accomplishments necessarily in the world, but when you speak to her. She's magnetic, she's interesting, she's totally and utterly authentic in everything that she says, and she'll probably be the most real person that you've ever met. So without further ado, I'm going to bring my new friend, who I've been able to spend a little bit of time over the last few weeks. I'm going to bring you onto the show. So Sarah, welcome.
Hi. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I'm not supposed to cry at the beginning of the talk.
I know. I feel like we've had a few conversations up until this point, and now it's real. Now we have people in front of us that I can share you with, which is really, really exciting. But I think that, like I said before, the best part about this is the fact that you and I are so different, yet we're still very much the same.
Yes.
You and I have acting background, and we have an interest in performance. And both you and I use that skill to be able to share powerful messages with the world. And I think that's why we connect so much, because I was like, this girl, she's just so... She just rocks in so many different ways.
I felt the exact same thing.
Why? Where have you been all my life? But Sarah, I want you, if you're comfortable, to share your story with our community to start off. And then we're going to jump into why this is so important today in this time of year. And you could talk about what brought you to what you do today. Talk a little bit about your career. And I'll give you a little bit more of the screen, and then we'll get the show on the road. You good with that?
That sounds great.
Okay, amazing. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh, great. Yeah, sorry. So
where is yours?
So on December 19th, 2008, as a lot of you saw in the wonderful advertisements for this, my mother and brother were killed in a botched burglary in our home. This was a 17-year-old boy from our neighborhood who was actually, we were friends with his family, but he was just looking for some things to steal, to sell, to make cash before Christmas. It's the time of year where that happens actually pretty frequently. He broke into our home. He didn't expect my brother to be home because it was winter break for college, but he was a high schooler, and he panicked, shot my brother, fled the scene, and then he realized that he forgot his coat. And by the time he came back to our home, my mother had found my brother, and they had an altercation, and he killed her as well. Thankfully for our family, within 72 hours, they did figure out who did it, which is something that a lot of people don't get closure around, which I'm very, very thankful for. But it was shocking to find out this was somebody not only that we knew, but also somebody's family who we cared about deeply. And one of the things I felt in the immediate aftermath was this desire to skip to the end of the spiritual process, so to speak, which was to say that I forgive him. If I know that forgiveness is the thing that's supposed to bring us closure and healing, then why can't I just say the words and even believe them with my whole heart and my whole being and say, I forgive this person. I bear them no ill will. I only want healing for them. I just want their journey to be, magnificent after this. I don't hold anything against them. And I tried saying it again and again, and I really thought that I believed it, and I really felt that I meant that. And then years went by, and I realized that instead of talking about him like he was a person, I had started reducing him to almost an event that had happened to our family. He was the twister that came through and picked up our house and threw it into Oz, into Technicolor. He was almost just flattened into this non-human figure for me. And I also realized that no matter how much I tried to say I forgave him, and no matter how much I tried to humanize him, anytime things were going wrong in my life, his face would pop up in this way that was almost like an intrusive thought. Something would go wrong at work, and suddenly I would see his face, and that didn't feel, something about that didn't sit right with me. And so I started doing more research into, well, who is he as a person now? I knew him when he was 17 and younger, but what has his life been like in prison? And as I did a little more research, I realized he was in a prison in Southwest Virginia that is notorious for human rights violations. They had had a hunger strike within the prison to protest their conditions. A lot of the prisoners are in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. And it shocked me, even though I had been saying that I'd forgiven this person for years, how much it really chilled me and bothered me to think about him in those conditions. And it grounded me again in the fact that this is a person that we're talking about who did this. And yes, this person took the two people that I was closest to in the world and the people that I loved most in the world from me, but he's still a person who's now experiencing a life that is complex and horrible beyond this event. And so that's when I realized, I was like, if I really mean this, it felt like my life had come to this impasse. I either needed to accept that I hadn't forgiven him and say, well, what does that mean? And what would justice look like in this situation? And what am I owed from this person in order to heal and move on? Or I needed to figure out how to forgive, and what did that really mean, and how could I do that in a way that really stuck? And it prompted this whole crazy, spiritual, I say vision quest, but mostly as a joke. I was not like, walking through a desert or, doing anything like crazy, but it was all this research and soul searching, and one of the things that brought me the most clarity was stumbling upon this concept in Judaism that you can only forgive what has been done to you. God has to forgive crimes against God, but we have to get really specific about what has been done to us. And that, after all of this digging, was this light bulb moment where I realized I keep trying to forgive this boy, now a man, for killing my mother and brother, when that's not what happened to me. What happened to me is that I lost my mother and brother. What happened to me is that they weren't at my college graduation or my wedding, or they won't meet my kids, hypothetical kids. um, but what happened to me was a loss of a sense of safety and security, and this idea that the social contract we all walk around upholding is stronger than it is. The sense of that fragility. I had to get really clear and make an inventory of what are my wounds, and also acknowledge that this list is going to keep growing for the rest of my life. So what does it look like to take stock of that first before I try to jump to the end and say I forgive you, and then say, okay, what does this list demand in order to be healed, and how much of this list is my personal responsibility to heal, and how much of this can he realistically provide any clarity or answers around. And as I made that list and sort of looked at everything, there wasn't anything that he could do. And it's not to say he doesn't owe a debt to society. It's not to say that he doesn't owe things to other people. But I looked at my list and said, I bet that I would feel a lot freer if I could let this go. And I really dug into the word forgiveness and this concept of, to forgive something, it doesn't mean to say that it's okay. It's actually the opposite of that. You're saying what you did is not okay. But I acknowledge that you are more than that, and I am releasing you from the debt of obligation to me around this point. And so once I got clear about that, I sat down and I wrote him a letter, which, to be very honest, felt very condescending. This person asked for my forgiveness.
Yeah.
It's very possible he received this letter and was like, gross.
You still have a copy of that letter?
I do. I have it on my phone. And I took a picture of it before I sent it, because I was like, I want to remember what I said. But I mean, the second I put that letter in the mailbox, I just felt this huge pressure in my chest, like unwind and burst. It really felt like this almost rebirth. Sounds gross, but there was just this huge release. And some of it was a very sad release, and some of it was a very cathartic release. But the craziest part of it for me is that there were parts of myself that came rushing back once I was no longer bound in this tether to him. And that all this, I did not realize the ways in which not healing that part of this process was actually keeping my mom and my brother's memory at arm's length from me. And they came rushing back to me in ways that I felt like I could own for the first time in the 7 years it took me to do that process. So
I want to hear from you what was in the letter, because I can't imagine when you're writing a letter to the person who murdered your family, and you even knew a little bit about him. And for some of the people that just tuned on right now, we've had a lot of people who joined us after the first few minutes when you started your story. That part of the story I find to be so compelling, because this wasn't someone who was a complete stranger to your family. This was someone that I know your mother took a liking to and was sensitive to, that you knew that he came from a really troubled background, and he had a troubled personality. And when he was in the presence of your mother, I remember what you told me, that she used to tell you. I'd love to share that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We didn't, I don't necessarily want to say he came from a troubled background, because his two siblings were close friends of ours, and they're like wonderful people who have these careers healing people in different ways. And this was a family that, not that we all know that, I was going to say, this is a family that went to church, but we all know that that doesn't necessarily, that can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
We know a lot of people who do and don't, and, faith and morality is more complex.
I think I got it wrong. I think you meant that he was, in general, like a troubled kid.
Yes. There was something that made her, I have these distinct memories of her when we would be in the van. She would pause, she would see him mowing the lawn or see him out, walking down the street, and she'd roll down the window and wave to him, and she'd be like, I just want him to know that someone sees him. I just really want him to know that he's seen, because I just get the sense that he's got a lot going on. And he was definitely a little more, he wasn't as emotionally open. He was more difficult to reach in that sense. She was this mother figure in our community. And so she did that a lot, but there was a sense with her that she was like, this kid is harder to get through to for some reason. And when we got that news in the police station about who it was, it honestly felt like finding out that this, if everybody's life is a movie, let's say, it almost felt like this. You think that the murder is going to be solved, and it's going to be like, oh, of course it was so-and-so. But it felt like this person who was a minor side character. It was the last person we would have thought of in a lot of ways. We were waiting for some big twist that didn't come. It was just like, wow, it was almost crazy how banal it was.
That's really amazing. We have a lot of people watching. I'd love actually in the chat box, whoever's watching, to tell me where you're tuning in from, what city you're tuning in from, because I want to know who we're speaking to, just so that we can impress Sarah about the diversity of the community that was interested in the subject. Because like we mentioned in the beginning of the show, you and I are very different, from very different backgrounds. I'm a Jewish woman who's religious. You're a non-Jewish woman, but the concept of forgiveness is such a universal concept. It's a language that we all speak, because the resistance to forgiveness is such a human condition. And tonight I want to talk about some things with you that might be a little bit of a surprise to you, but I think it's interesting. I want to talk about the concept of forgiving others, and I want to talk about the concept of asking others to forgive you. And I'll explain to you why. I see that we have Rachel from Houston and Jackie from Brooklyn who's tuning in, and Michelle from Chicago. And I'm curious if anybody from the West Coast.
Oregon, I see.
Well, Brittany from Oregon. Yeah, welcome, Brittany. Very spiritual. Nice to meet you. As more cities will come in, I'll explain to everybody who's tuning in that Jews are very into their calendar. And all throughout the year, there are different energies within our calendar. And tomorrow night is probably one of the most well-known Jewish holidays, even amongst non-Jews, which is called Yom Kippur. Mm-hmm. And this event was not designed in a vacuum. It was designed to prepare me personally. It was like selfishly designed for what is one of the most paramount themes of Yom Kippur, which is called the Day of Forgiveness, which is, there's a tradition that we are supposed to turn to each other and ask for forgiveness. I think about what that means. It means like it's really, really hard to do something difficult, and that's when you're doing it alone. Kind of like a dancing in the middle of Times Square, right? On your own. But if you're part of a flash mob and you know that everybody will be with you at the same time, same place, then you know that it's like, it's cool. I know there's going to be with me, and we'll all be uncomfortable together. You get that? Yom Kippur is like the Jewish flash mob for forgiveness. Hi, Eliza and Sarah from Toronto, and Elizabeth from Houston, Texas. It's the Jewish flash mob in a sense that when you ask people for forgiveness, why do you think it's so challenging, Sarah? Think about it.
I think it takes a lot of self-reflection and humility and vulnerability in order to...
Vulnerability, yes, that's what it is. You're vulnerable because you have to admit that you did something wrong, and you can't be vague about it. You can't just say, hey, will you forgive me if I did anything for you? You have to say, will you forgive me that I did something for you?
Yes.
I know that I hurt you, and I want to know if I could take responsibility for it, and if you could set me free of my own challenges.
Yes.
So hard to do that. I'm thinking about the most important relationships in my life, right? I'm married. You're married also.
Yes, I am.
I have 6 kids, and you're praying.
Yes, I am.
Right. So we both are kind of in the same space, in a sense that we're building this familial, circle around us. And we also have extended family members, and we have coworkers and friends, etc. And as we go through our lives, we bump against people kind of like the bowling ball that bumps it. And we essentially, I would say, we hurt people on a regular basis. Yeah. But it's so much easier in life to look at a pretty picture, a Van Gogh picture, and admire a beauty that is not ours, than to look in a mirror and see some of our flaws.
Oh, yeah.
To be part of a community where everybody, all at once, the days before Yom Kippur, are calling each other and opening up these discussions, and there's like a time limit. It means that we're all doing this together, because I know family feuds go on.
There's nothing deeper. I mean, those can be decades.
Yes, they can go on for decades. They can go on until people could take family feuds to the grave.
Okay, wait, I have a question, and I don't mean to take us totally off track.
Go ahead.
Does that time limit ever feel do you feel like people ever flip it and they're like, I can't believe Sarah didn't call me to ask for forgiveness? Like, you have the thing that you were waiting for the call on?
You know what? Such a great question. Yes. But I think that, first of all, we have someone that's tuning in from Australia, which I think is really cool. So, hey, Sammy and Courtney from California. That's our West Coaster. Sarah, listen. The goal is really to ask people for forgiveness. But everything in Judaism is about taking responsibility, and it's not about human rights. It's not like I have a right for you to come and admit to me that you are wrong. We have a personal responsibility to set people free. There's another tradition which I love very much, which is every night before we go to sleep, we say a small little paragraph that says, I set people free. Whoever wronged me, I'm going to sleep. I'm going to put it behind me.
I love that.
Now, I'll tell you something interesting. The first few times I did it, because I didn't do it my whole life, I wasn't as religious as my whole life. I never even knew that prayer existed. First few times I did it, I felt it was a little bit of lip service. I was like, I forgive these people. But gosh darn it, my brother could have done so much better. And like we say, the longest distance in the world is the distance between your head and your heart. What you know to be true, what you want to be true. But when you're emotionally charged, it's just the long, there's no way to access that higher way of thinking. Nights like tonight, when you spend time gathering wisdom and figuring out skills, it is what closes the gap between the head and the heart. It's what enables you to rise to the occasion and become the person that you want to be, despite your emotional challenges, despite things pulling in a different direction, which is a really, really high level. And the more you engage with these types of conversations, the more you have that access point. So the more I sat down every single night and said, like, I set people free. I set people free. And I'm going to move forward and move on. The more it became not just something that you do that, like when you have an opportunity, when a coworker bothers you, or when you have a long family feud, or you know what, let's get real for a second. We have women tuning in, right? Mm-hmm. How many women, I'm curious, and that's not something that you can necessarily put in a chat box. How many women were raped by a boyfriend in college or even in high school? What does that look like in terms of setting yourself free? What about people who talk bad about you at work and you didn't get that promotion or you even lost your job because of it? What about your sister who talks behind your back and tries to get everybody? What about that best friend? What about your mom? What about if you fill in the blank? But there's so many opportunities, and even like the smallest of things. I remember one time I was like trying to get a parking spot in front of Target. And this really obnoxious looking teenager steals a parking spot that I was waiting for, gets out of the car, puts up his middle finger, and then like keeps walking into Target. Now this kid who's like half my age, I think I was probably 9 months pregnant at the time also. So that just like, really?
I need this.
It's exactly what I needed. Exactly. I think what I found to be so fascinating is I will never cross paths with this person again in my life. So goodness gracious, why is it important for me to extend myself in terms of the area of forgiveness? He doesn't deserve it. We don't have a relationship. Is it making the world a better place at all? What do you think about that?
I think that the strange thing to me is that we're still talking about that moment. And so of course you have a relationship with him, even if your paths never cross again. Wow. That person is a part of your story and your thinking and has shaped the way that you interact with everyone on a regular basis. And that was the thing that I was feeling was Xavier was in prison. I was never going to see him or talk to him again. And yet I still had an ongoing relationship with him. And I realized that that relationship still needed work. And in a funny way, the parallel to that was that my mother and brother were dead, but I still had a relationship with them. It was a new relationship. Conversations were a little more one-sided. But it was, you still get signs and things and you realize like, oh, because I love this person and because they have indelibly left a mark on me in some way, they have changed how I perceive the world and myself. That relationship doesn't go away. It's ongoing. And for me, that work is about the constant reminder that, and this is what I wrote in the letter to Xavier, is that I don't want to be held, or I don't want to have my humanity reduced to only the worst things I've ever done. I want to be more than that. I want to be more than a victim of this crime. I want to be more than, the things I've said to my brothers or to my ex-boyfriends or, to my professors or whatever. And if I want that for myself, then I have to want that for you too. I have to believe that your humanity is bigger and more complex and more nuanced than this one thing that you did, no matter how big that thing is. And I think that even that moment in the parking lot with that teenager that you had, the reason it's important is because it's not just that it's flexing a muscle. It's not even just about you. I do think that there is something small and energetic that happens when we even look at each other with a little more compassion and go, I really in my bones believe that you are more than just this, like, sorry, I'm gonna cuss, asshole moment where you stuck up your middle fingers and treated me like I didn't matter. It's about what you do when you say, even if you have disrespected me, that doesn't mean I'm going to treat you with disrespect. I am still going to give you the same respect, because your humanity can't actually be stripped just because you've done something egregious or atrocious or even something small and annoying.
Can I tell you something?
Huh.
It's something that you said struck a chord with me, because you're like, the reason why it matters is because you remember that story many years later and you're still talking about it. And I realized why I remember it, because it was the first time that I did something that I had learned about in a class, a Jewish class, that said that there's a concept of judging people favorably, which we're talking about forgiveness and judging people. These are such abstract concepts. Like, practically, what does that actually mean?
Yes.
What I love so much about being a teacher, someone who like studies Judaism and spreads Judaism, is because there's just practical steps to these very abstract concepts. And I'll explain to you something that I think that might actually blow your mind. When we talk about judging people favorably, Judaism says that we have an obligation to make up a story in our mind, a plausible story that proves your point, by the way, Sarah, that says that this person is bigger than this action. And this is the reason why I know that. Can I tell you an interesting story? I'm pretty sure that it's in maybe chapter 1 or chapter 2 of Stephen Covey's book, right? Of 7 Habits, right? And he talks about how he used to take the subway every single morning at like 6:30 in the morning. I really don't know if I have the details correct. I probably should have looked them up, but the story just fits in really well. But it is such a mind-blowing story. In the same way that I remember that story with that kid, you'll remember the story, Sarah, for the rest of your life, probably. So he says that he takes the same subway every single morning, and he always went to the first car in the train, because that was the quietest car. And there was the same like 10 businessmen that were always in that train every single morning. And there was kind of like an understanding between all of them, which was that I don't talk to you. You don't talk to me. It's an ungodly hour. And it was a beautiful thing that went on for many years. One guy sips his coffee, another guy reads the newspaper, 3 guys are sleeping, and this is how it's been. And one fateful morning, a new guy comes on to the first car of the subway train, and he comes on with the worst things that you could possibly imagine, which were 2 children.
Oh no.
And he says that the father of the kids plants himself down next to him, Stephen Covey, the author of the story and book, and he puts his head and his hands pretty much in his lap, and it looks like he's almost sleeping or something. And the kids begin to wreak havoc. The coffee that was being drunk by one of the businessmen all over the floor, newspapers shredded to bits. He says, I'm not exaggerating the slightest. Needless to say, the 3 people who are sleeping are no longer sleeping.
Oh no.
Now they're all looking at him because he happens to be the lucky neighbor. And they're like, say something to him. Goodness gracious, this is public space. And so he goes with this attitude, after having that anger festering inside him. He goes with this attitude towards this new guy sitting next to him. Like, how am I going to show him like normal like decency? And so he says, excuse me, sir. Can you control your children, please? It's 6:30 in the morning. And the guy picks his head up from his lap, essentially. And he says, my goodness, I'm so sorry. You're absolutely right. It's just that we came from the hospital just now. They've been up all night because their mother passed away this morning. And I just want to get them home and into bed. Sarah, listen to this. It took 5 words. 5 words for him to flip from, how am I going to show this guy, to, oh my God, how am I going to help this guy? Their mother died this morning. That's it. And I think the way it works is, when I go back to that story about that teenager, I see him, and the first thing that I think of, it just like when you do like a 1,000-piece puzzle, if you're missing 3 pieces, you could pretty much tell the gist of the picture.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a sunset, and 3 pieces is not going to change the sunset to be something completely different. But when it comes to a human story, those 3 pieces change the entire picture. 5 words, that's all it took.
Yes. Yes.
So that obligation of like making up a story, and that was the first time I actually put that into practice. And I remember thinking to myself, it must be, and I thought of him as a baby, which helps so much, by the way. When you think of your perpetrator, no matter how hard, the gardener or your grandmother, you know, like anybody in between who rubs you the wrong way or does the wrong thing, when you think of them as a baby, someone loved them once upon a time, or someone didn't love them.
That's crucial. Yes.
Someone didn't love them. And this is the best he's got right now.
Yes.
He's got. And he might have just come from a very similar situation to the guy on the train.
It's true. Or even, you know, one of the things I think about all the time is even if there isn't a catastrophic thing happening in the moment right now for that person, we don't know what foundation they've been building upon this entire time. This may just be the moment that it's unconsciously coming out, or it may just be that, you know, it may be that this thing happened 6 months ago, but now they finally have the space and time to feel it, and it's coming out in a way that they can't control in that moment. But the more you can extend a sense of grace, and maybe this is the writer in me, but I always love to think about what don't I know, even with the people that I know the most intimately in my life. You know, my husband and I there was a day the other night where he was grumpy, and I knew he was grumpy because it was to the point where I came out for the date and I was like, how do I look? This dress doesn't make me look fat, right? And he's like, I don't know, turn around. And I was like, oh, you're going to answer the question. And so we got the same thing. I just was like, okay. We got in the car and I was like, did you have a bad day? And he was like, yeah, I had the worst day and all this, you know, because I felt myself getting angry. And then I was like, pause. Did you have a bad day? And the whole thing comes out and I'm like, of course, none of that was about me. None of it is like, you know, the key now, and some of this work with Xavier really opened up this idea that like, I have to give people the benefit of the doubt and not personalize things. Like, because part of this process was that, you know, and I've thought about this, even you talked about, you know, being, you know, you asked how many people have been raped by a high school or college boyfriend, or one of the sad but liberating truths was most of the people who have hurt me the worst weren't really thinking about me. Like, it wasn't actually like the boyfriend who did that in college. It was that he was thinking more about himself than he was about me. It was a dehumanizing of me, but it wasn't actually as malicious as I had made it out to be in my head. And most of these little interactions that happen all the time, I actually think there's a lot more evil that people do to one another that's born from the fact that they're not considering the other person's humanity than there is a specific intent to harm. Sometimes there is, because people, you know, like the power of that charges them in a certain way.
Right. I want to stop for 1 second. I want to make sure that our audience knows that you can send in questions. Just put them into the chat box. And we have an amazing producer who's working behind stage that's going to send us all the questions. So if you have any questions from this point forward for either Sarah or myself, then just put in the chat box and we'll call out your name, and we'd love to be able to address your question. And hopefully one day, since I live in Miami, which is an easy destination spot to convince people to come and visit and coffee date, we can even have deeper conversations about it. Sarah, you know, you mentioned something that really touched me a lot. And I think we mentioned it the first conversation that we had, which is that you learn to define people in bigger ways than their actions. You say this person is bigger than the action that they did. And you made it very clear. And I appreciate that. And in case anybody just tuned in and didn't hear that Sarah say this, because I want to make sure that they hear Sarah say this, it's not that you're not holding them accountable.
That's the crucial piece. The crucial piece for me is that you have to hold people accountable for their actions. So forgiving something does not mean saying that it's okay. Or if somebody is continuing to abuse you, that does not mean allowing abuse to continue, because that would be disrespectful not only to yourself, but it would be allowing them to stay complicit in something that is worse than the best person that they can be. You're not holding them to. It's actually condescending in some ways. I've thought a lot about that. That was like a wake up moment in my 20s where I realized, oh, letting other people do this to me is actually unhealthy for them too. I'm not the martyr that I think I am.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you hold people accountable for their actions And you, while still maintaining in your, somewhere else out here, that this is a person who is nuanced, who has many different facets, some of which are, and it's not painting an unrealistic picture. Some of those facets are probably pretty gnarly. Like, they're not all great, but this person is always multifaceted, and they're not just the thing that they've done.
Yeah.
I always remember that, like, if I get in a fight with a family member, I like I have a lot of nurses in my family, so I'll have these moments where I'm like, remember, they help people every day. Remember, they help people every day. We're having a fight right now.
Can I tell you something really interesting? The reason why I really like that is because everything goes both ways. Forgiveness is not only about extending forgiveness to other people, but that really uncomfortable thing. And like we said before, for new people tuning in, we said that tomorrow is Yom Kippur in the Jewish calendar. And that's the day that it's like the Jewish flash mob for forgiveness, that everybody turns to the people that are important to them in their life. And they ask for forgiveness. And the reason why we do that is not necessarily because the other person needs that, but because you need that. It's permission to let go of the reasons why you hate yourself. And I think a lot of times, I don't tell me if I'm alone, but I can't be alone. I feel like my mistakes is just one big Groundhog Day movie where it's like, seriously? I just told myself I was never going to do this again. And I did it again.
I do that, like, as soon as I'm like, I'm going to get better at this thing, it really does feel like it's like, okay, here's 10 opportunities to prove yourself, and you're going to stumble through 9 of them. Or we talked about this. The second I sent that letter, it felt like this challenge from the universe where every single person I was holding on to not forgiving came out of the woodwork and was like, what about me? In some kind of way. And I was like, oh, I guess I'm going to have to really, like, I'm gonna have to, put my money where my mouth is on this.
It's really, really hard. And I think that discomfort that one feels when they stand and they say, listen, this is a little awkward because subconsciously I'm admitting that I actually am flawed and I've made mistakes, but I want to know if you could release me of those mistakes. And Yom Kippur is one of, they say, called the day of like cleansing. It's the day where I get to start anew and fresh. And we wear white on Yom Kippur because that's the sign of, like, it's like a blank slate. Literally, blank slate, and I could start the painting from the beginning. Adina Stilerman, who do I want to be? What's the deal? Like, what type of relationships I want to have,
The fascinating thing to me is that we don't think enough about, one of the things that I wanted to release myself from when I wrote him that letter was I wanted to release myself as one of my primary identifiers being victim and villain, because I felt like that kept me very stuck in a certain, and it's not to say that, like, it is very important, I think, to acknowledge and feel your victimhood, to understand that you've been wounded, to not pretend and try to power through and, like, not acknowledge your wounds. Because as my therapist used to say, like, if you walk around on an infected leg for a really long time when you could just get an amputation, you're actually really hurting yourself. But
wait, you know what? This is actually something interesting. Because when you were saying that you wrote this letter, right, and you didn't want to define yourself by the victimhood, so Joelle sent in a question that I think is really interesting. And it's the same question that I asked you when we first had our conversation, which is, did he ever respond or show remorse? And you know why she's asking that question? Because she's thinking along the same lines as me and many other people, which is that the only way I'll get my closure is if I get a response or he shows remorse. And you gave such a brilliant answer.
I told myself I was not going to send that letter until I knew that his response would not change how I felt. It was very important to me to get to a place where this was what I had to say could not be changed by anything that he would say. And that I knew what my decision was from my end completely. And I really got to a place where I anticipated the idea that he might read this letter, scroll back, you know what I mean? I'd do it again, and that I would have to be okay with that. Because ultimately my decision was, it's not that it wasn't about him, but it was about me acknowledging what in my healing process was mine and my responsibility and what things I still felt he owed me. And that's what I wrote to him in this letter. What I said to him was, I want to make it really clear, I am okay. What you did was not okay. There are many ways in which I don't know that either of us will ever fully heal from what you did. And I acknowledge that you harmed yourself in this process, not just me. But I want you to know that even though I'm still deeply wounded by this, I don't believe that you owe me anything. You don't owe me an apology. You don't owe me an answer. You don't owe me an explanation, because there's nothing you can give that's going to bring these two people back to me. At this point, I have to make a decision between holding on to an anger that will power me and that feels like it's its own weird form of justice, or deciding that I'm going to step into a new role, which is a person who's not defined by that anger and not defined by the crime that has been committed against me in this instance. So I told him that what I wished for him was a life full of healing, and that I wished that he found peace. But it wasn't me saying, I want a relationship with you. It wasn't me saying, hope we can be friends, XOXO, like.
Or even that I expect a response because you don't need it, which is a really high level to get to when you say that someone else does not define my healing.
Yes. Well,
your actions are not going to, I don't need your actions to move forward in my life.
Well, and this is an extreme situation. And one of the questions I get a lot is, well, like, that's all well and good, but he's in a prison where you don't, and so there is a sense of closure around that, right? Like, it's like when it's your father and you may have a relationship with your father where that thing is ongoing. And I understand that there are varied levels to how this works. But for me, that thing did translate to my day-to-day relationships, which was, in what ways am I keeping myself captive by holding us in a relationship where my anger is making you the villain and me the good guy? Or vice versa. In what ways am I keeping myself captive and beating myself up and delaying my progress, or not being the best that I can be in the world because I'm shaming myself for what I've done to you in these small ways and cutting off parts of myself, instead of just coming to you and saying, I'm sorry, and I'm holding myself accountable for what I've done to you, and I hope that that's acceptable to you. And if it is, then I hope that we can move past this. But I want you to know, it's funny, so apologies or coming forward and asking for forgiveness, I think there's this bump around ego, and there's a lot of this sense that there's this real cultural sense, at least in America, that apologizing means that you're really giving up this huge chunk of yourself. And I actually see it as the opposite. I very much see it as asking for a piece of yourself back. That when you've harmed someone, you've given them this part of you that isn't the best part of yourself. And you're saying, I actually want that back. I'm going to take care of that and clean that mess up for you. I'm so sorry. I don't want you to have to carry that. And I also need to fix that.
So great. I think essentially when they say that every single human being on the planet, regardless of the color of their skin or the religion they identify with or the religion they don't identify with, every single human being was made in the image of God, essentially means that at the core, we always know exactly who we are, and our actions could be separated from that. And we have the right to be able to ask people, can I go back? Can I go back to my essence, please?
Yes.
I want to be able to connect myself to the essence. Like we said before, that the longest distance in the world is a distance between your head and your heart. You want to be a certain way, and we make choices that bring us away from who we want to be. And then we do this every year, is that it's the concept of Teshuva. Teshuva really means I want to go back. Can I start again? I want to go back. I want to start again. And I want to go back to my core of who I am. And there's this like liberating feeling when you're finished with the day. And we fast throughout the day, so it really focuses. It allows you to focus on what it is that I guess the magnitude of this job of like moving forward and starting again. It really feels like that sense of like, I got a chance. I got another chance. I have to say that you mentioned that people ask you, okay, it's fine, it's nice and dandy that he's in jail, but what happens if it's someone that's in your life on a regular basis? That's what I love so much about tonight, because tonight is really not just about having an hour, 50 minutes together so that we could fix the rest of our lives. So many good questions came in. I'm going to read them now. Alex, I'm going to read your question. Courtney, I'm going to read your question. Mary Ellen, I'm going to read your question as well. But these questions that are coming in, you can see that there is a desire to move forward and to handle emotions, forgive and forget. We'll talk about it in a minute. These are real life people that they're talking about in their lives that are active, and they can't just separate themselves physically from the person. And therefore, there's a recurring reminder that this person is a challenging person to deal with. And that's why we offered, and a lot of you actually got the email about this, that this is not the end, and Rome wasn't built in a day. That we offered something called Souled Conversations and Souled Clubs, where you get to feel a little bit more of an immersive experience in the subject. I know in Sold Conversations, we're going to be talking about really difficult parents, a whole entire class that's dedicated towards challenging parents, which most parents are challenging in some way for whatever reason. And I mentioned in the description of the class that on average, parents will spend $250,000 on you, a truckload of diapers, lots of tuition, gas, everything. You would think that you'd worship the very ground that they walk on, yet it is such a challenging relationship often. And spending an hour trying to figure out how to become great through that relationship is life-changing. Things like romantic relationships is a whole other class. How to go much deeper in the subject so that you're truly changed forever. The club is actually going through a book called The Choice. Edith Eger is the author of the book, and she's a Holocaust survivor. And I read this book. I couldn't put it down. I ignored my children. I hid in the bathroom, and I had to finish this book.
This is going on my list, obviously.
It's brilliant. And we have Stacy, who's our sold instructor, who goes through the book and allows you to look through the prism of this book what relationships look like. And I think it's very interesting because I've been to Poland over a dozen times. And we've toured the camps because I'm a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. And I feel like it's my duty to be able to tell the world about the story that happened because it's a human story. It's not a Jewish story. Now, when I come back from Poland, I'm armed with so much inspiration and wisdom from the stories that you hear. Do you think that that it bothers me if someone in my family is short with me? I'm like, you can do no wrong. I don't care if I don't have all the money that I want. Okay, fine. I'm not as thin as, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
I have food on my table. I have a pool in my backyard. I have so much water. I'm swimming in it. And these people were like, they died of thirst. And there's this deep appreciation for life when you are faced with death at this doorstep. And that's the beauty of her book. Not only that, though, but she's so raw and she's so real. She talks about these relationships. And so therefore, you'll get an email after this that tells you more about how you can sign up for the clubs and conversations. So tonight doesn't become one of those things that you attend and you're like, that was really nice and I want to be a better person. And then it's Groundhog Day and tomorrow you're not a better person. It's really about getting to the core and learning real skills. Because guess why? According to the Harvard Happiness Study and many, many other studies that were done after that, the number one factor that contributes to your happiness, Sarah and Adina and anybody else that's tuning in from all over the country, is going to be the quality of relationships. So even for selfish reasons, to work on it because we look for happiness in areas where we're just not going to get it. And so therefore, it's time to get back to the core. It's time to get back to the soul.
I love it. I'm signing up.
Yeah. Fantastic. I get to spend more time with you.
Yes,
so
please.
Alex actually mentioned, she says, I struggle with forgiveness. And I definitely don't forget. How do I forgive and move on instead of forgiving and forgetting?
So
I want you to explain the question to the viewers as well. I want you to tell everybody what you think about that.
So I really struggled with the phrase forgive and forget, especially after what happened, because I'm not going to forget that my mother and brother were murdered. That's just like not a thing that happens. You know what I mean?
Ever. For the rest of your life.
Yeah, you don't. It's not something, my life has been so profoundly changed by that there is no forgetting that. What there is, I think, is a moment, and this is what I think that the core of it's about moving. We've talked about this, about moving. What is the message behind the words? Like, why is that phrase said that way? And I think for a long time I felt this thing, that this wrong that had been done to me was like a neon sign above my head. If you needed to understand why I was doing everything, you could not understand why Sarah Montana reacted the way she did in everyday conversation, or had fight or flight responses, or did anything that I did or said without understanding that my family was murdered. That was just this driving force in my life. And the reason I felt I needed to, not the reason I felt I needed to forgive, but what forgiveness gave me back was this ability to feel like I could move past that, and the neon sign flickered out. There were many things about my day that were no longer driven or directed or influenced by my family's murder. It was a thing that happened to me that I will always come back around to and that I'll always have to contend with, but it was no longer at the in the driver's position of my life. That, I think, is what, when we say we've got to let things go, even when you have a small, like, fight with your aunt, you think about how the rest of your day goes, or the way that you go through everything sort of in this like triggered, charged state. You can say triggered, charged, whatever it is, but it, like, little things like this can also, these little grievances can change the way you interact with everybody else in your life. So it's not about forgetting. You're not going to forget that you had a fight. I still remember fights I had with people in 7th grade. The point is that fight is no longer influencing my day-to-day decisions. It's a story that I can tell, the same way that Adina you talked so beautifully about, like, this is a story you tell about the kid in Target with the parking space. You're not still actively stewing, or you're not now fighting people and going, well, this is how I got to up my parking space game, and I'm a winner. That's another very real possibility somebody could have taken away from that interaction. They could have said, like, if you're not first, you're last. I got to squeeze in. I got to be more aggressive. No, the point in forgiving is that we let this thing go so that it doesn't dictate all of our actions and responses and have a grip on us anymore, that we regain a sense of control around our reactions and actions.
Did they say that bearing a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die from it, right? And I love that so much, because all of Judaism is based on what we call the Torah, which some people call the Old Testament or the Bible. And it's nowhere does it say that you're not allowed to hate someone. It says something about not hating someone in your heart, but you're not allowed to actually. Hating someone is a human reaction often when they do something wrong to you. And yes, human emotions are actually not negative. They're just opportunities for something else. The question is, what do you do with that emotion when it first presents itself?
Yes.
And it's like cheese in the refrigerator that stays too long and it gets moldy. You either eat the cheese or you get rid of it. But if you're going to keep it in the fridge for too long, then it festers and it grows. And so when the hateful thoughts, and I just wanted to mention this because Eliza asked a question. She said, how do you get rid of so much hatred and anger and hateful thoughts?
I haven't thought about that.
And that's really crucial. Eliza, you really touched upon something that is so relatable to everybody, because human emotion is usually, actually, it's a gift. Yes. It often is a cue to stay away from some people who are not healthy for you if they're constantly making you angry, to set up boundaries. But sometimes it's an opportunity to be able to work on yourself, give context to the relationship, and say, I choose to set these feelings free so they don't transform and become moldy and become something that we call a grudge. A grudge is when you don't let go of those feelings and do the internal work. That's all.
It has to be channeled into the proper, like, to me, I learned somewhere along the line that, and I cannot remember who to attribute this to. I'm so sorry, probably thousands of years ago. Yeah. The idea was that anger is not usually the root emotion. Anger is the messenger. Anger is the messenger telling you what needs to be addressed. But once you get if you listen, you can't ignore your anger. And this is a thing I think that often gets conflated that makes me really nervous. Nobody should be ignoring their angry feelings. Nobody should be pushing them down to try to be positive. Even if you're trying to forgive someone, the point is actually to really take stock of your anger, because your anger is there to help cauterize this wound so that you're not continuing to hemorrhage, right? You use this anger to help direct you to where the pain is. And then when you see where the pain is, you can sit down with it and say, what do you need? What does this wound really need in order to heal? But if you stuff your anger or discount it, these wounds are just continuing to fester. And so it's not about taking hateful thoughts and pushing them away. In fact, it's about following them. And you don't let them ramp up and get out of control. Down with your hateful. My joke is always, I sit down with my hateful thoughts and I give them tea. Like, when that feeling comes up, I'm like, oh, I just like hate this person, or oh, this person makes me so mad. I sit down with a journal and I write down the thoughts, and then I have a dialogue with myself about that. I'm like, well, why is this making you so angry? Where is this coming from? Is there a time in the past that this is triggering, or that's connected to from like an old childhood wound? Is this because this is something that you feel insecure about, or did this other person really truly mess up, like in a really like egregious way? and then I follow that, and sometimes by doing that process, what you end up finding out is it may just be somebody with a shopping cart who tried to take a scooter out of your cart on Black Friday. But what it actually is,
no.
Right, that in and of itself.
How dare they?
Right.
The response should be, you didn't pay for it yet.
Yeah, right.
You just choose to move it from one place to another place.
But then if I follow that thing, the thing is like, oh, right, actually what I'm feeling, the anger is covering up this feeling of scarcity. The anger is giving me an alarm system that says you still have a wound around the idea that you'll never have enough or that something could be taken away. And then you can get to the source of that thing and really actually make like true deep progress. So I'm actually very grateful for my hateful or angry thoughts or whatever you want to call them, as long as I listen to them and I treat them with the utmost reverence and respect.
Exactly.
If you dismiss them, they'll come out in really nasty volcanic ways that you can't control. And that's, I think, when you do the most harm to other people.
I want to read something that I think you're going to find beautiful. And then I want to end with a story that is really hard for me to say. Because one of the things I realized, Sarah, is the reason why so many people wanted to come tonight is because your story is not unique, even though the circumstances are, of course, unique. But the human condition of being challenged to forgive others and to ask for forgiveness is just so universal, and people were desperately interested. But Courtney Perry, she says, do you believe that the more you show your loved ones, people close to you, forgiveness, the more that they'll possibly learn to do the same? And I really love that because like now that I have a family, I've realized you can call it like a spiritual reflection or you can call it mirror neurons, but ultimately it's all the same thing.
Yes.
It's that it's the hardest thing to do. And I think it's a lot like jumping into a really cold pool of water. When you want to go swimming in a non-heated pool, you have to jump in and make yourself uncomfortable. And for about 5 minutes, it's uncomfortable. But what happens is at the end, it feels so good because your body gets used to it that you end up not wanting to come out. And so it's uncomfortable to extend forgiveness to other people when you don't feel they deserve it. But what it does do is that they start to reflect. It takes time, but they start to reflect. And then you set an energy all around you. Literally walk around with this bubble where people have a hard time not forgiving you because of the person that you have showed them that you are, that you prove to them that I look at every single person that I bump into, the paths that I cross. I look at every person as bigger than their actions, and therefore they feel they owe it back to you. And that, Courtney, I think was one of the most brilliant questions that you could have ever asked.
Yes.
A very challenging story. I don't even know if I've ever said this in public before. That's the truth. But many years ago, when I think I was probably 22 or 23, I worked in the medical industry in a doctor's office where they were doing medical research. And I was, essentially studying the medical research. And the first day I came to the office, there was a woman, and I'm going to change her name, but let's call her Katie. Katie immediately welcomed me in, and she became attached to me, and she says, this is going to be your best job. And she says, I love being friends with all my coworkers. She was super friendly. At some point, I started to pick up on instabilities within her. She would get jealous if I created relationships with some of the patients. She would get passive aggressive and angry. And at some point, it became a very toxic environment for me. Now, it happens to be that the person who owned the entire business was a close family friend. And I felt comfortable coming to him and saying, I think that we need to just separate, and I'll work in one department and she'll work in the other department because it's just getting too close for comfort. He ended up letting her go.
Ooh.
Now, this is so uncomfortable for me to say, but I didn't keep up with her afterwards. She lived in the same city as me. But I found out a few months later, she took her own life.
I'm sorry.
Now, Sarah, can you imagine how I felt when I got wind of that? The guilt?
Yeah.
I just didn't know what to do with myself. Immediately, I'm like, I killed her. I remember going to my mom at the time, may she rest in peace, and I remember saying, like, is it possible that I contributed to this? Like, she was out of, and she, of course, was saying what every good mom should say, which is, no, of course not. You're a good person. She was an emotionally unstable person from the beginning. In fact, her mother attempted suicide a few times, and she had confessed that to me, and she told me her whole story about dropping out of medical school because of her emotional conditions. I got that, but still something. So I ended up going to one of my close teachers, who I sat in a lot of classes like this, learning Judaism. And she told me, do you know that even after someone passes away, if you feel it's possible that you contributed some type of pain to their life, You go to their grave and you ask them for forgiveness. So do you know why I thought that that was so beautiful? Because it's proof. It's proof that when you ask people for forgiveness, you don't do it for the other person, and therefore they don't need to deserve it. You do it because you want to give yourself permission to let go.
Yes.
Because you are proving to yourself that you believe in your ability to change, you believe in your ability to grow, and you will not define yourself by your past and your actions. Because anybody who does that will never break free. And that's why we do that. And so it was right before Yom Kippur. So it was literally this time about 20 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 19 years ago.
Wow.
And it was the most uncomfortable, most emotional experience in my life. Going to the cemetery in Fort Lauderdale here and standing by the grave and asking for forgiveness. But that was when I realized that there's something about this in Jewish wisdom that says they understand the human condition.
Yes.
And it's a real pathway, real practical things in terms of growth and renewal and change and creating a better life for yourself. And I love that. So I want to end
That
with,
was so powerful. Sorry. Thank you for sharing that.
I think the first time I told this story, now I remember telling the story to a small group of people, and I couldn't get through the story without choking up. And the fact that I can get through the story now without choking up shows you the power of healing, and shows you how when you completely let go of something, then you could really understand it from an objective standpoint. So I wanted to tell everybody who is tuning in tonight, and we had such a beautiful amount of people, and they really stayed from the beginning till the end, which is really nice. It means that they like you, Sarah, a lot, and they can relate to you.
Thank you for coming. Oh my gosh.
I will say that the beauty of this is it's not the end, it's only the beginning. And you'll receive an email, but you might have received an email already about the opportunity to join one of the sold clubs or conversations, and it's free. And it always will be. It's literally just there to be able to bring more goodness into the world and give you a chance to be able to close that gap between the head and the heart, to become the person you want to be, to dream big when it comes to your relationships, and to look back one day at this night and say that was the beginning of something really, really special in my life. And learning is really the key for everything. It's inspiration is what allows you to rise to the occasion. And it says, I want to be a better person. And you know what I find so interesting? Often it's really catastrophic things. Like right after 9/11, remember, like there was not a single beeping horn in New York City. You couldn't hate a soul, because death often, or anything really catastrophic, is what really highlights the value of life, allows you to connect to that conscience that you have, the godliness, soul, whatever you want to call it, that core that nobody can take away from you. How do you actually mimic that? What you do is you engage in learning. You learn and you grow and you have these conversations, and then you'll see you'll become a better person. So I'm really thrilled that you're going to join either the Sold Club or the conversation. So I get to spend more time with you. Stacy does the club and I do the conversation, but I want to be able to connect with you ladies. So if you sign up, you have to, it's very limited space. That's another thing that I meant to announce, that it doesn't mean you'll be able to get in. It means that we have to keep it small, but maybe we'll be able to get to one in the future. They often close out quickly. But I want to thank you, Sarah.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me.
It wasn't just, I reached out to you because I thought you'd be a motivational speaker. I'll be honest with you. You ended up being someone that I have a feeling we'll like meet in person and have coffee together one day.
I'm coming to Miami. Let's be
absolutely. And hopefully we could, hopefully tonight was something, it set the tone for something even bigger than just forgiveness. Viewing everybody that you meet in life as bigger than the small things that we tend to define people. We often turn straight to judgment. And if we could rise above and look at people as human beings with deep, deep cores, I think that every problem in the world would be solved.
I'm with you.
Political strife. We're in a crazy world. And it's moments like this when I'm like, we can make a difference.
Absolutely. Even just those small moments of remembering each other's humanity and all of your, just the smallest day-to-day interactions, it can completely transform the way that people see themselves and the love that they allow into like themselves to receive and to give to other people, it really does have this like global domino effect if we continue to practice it even in the smallest places.
So I'm going to teach you one Hebrew word before we go, and
Yes.
let's teach everybody else. Before we came on, Sarah and I said a prayer together in Hebrew, which was I said in Hebrew, and Sarah closed her eyes, and it was very, very special. There's a Hebrew word that is neshama. You want to say it? Neshama.
Neshama.
It's a beautiful word, and what it means is it's the person's core. What we kept talking about the whole time, which is that you're going to define someone bigger than their actions. It means you're going to define them by their neshama, their core. Some people call it soul. Some people call it godliness. Some people call it consciousness. Some people call it conscience. You can call it whatever you want, but it's what makes you human. It's your ability to love, your ability to give. It's what makes you appreciate music and art. It's what makes you dream big. It's your defining feature as a human being, and nobody can take that away from you, and you can't take it away from other people. And that's really what this conversation is about. So I'm going to give all of our viewers a deep Jewish blessing that you should be able to rise to the occasion and become the great person that you're meant to be, and you should impact all the people around you, and therefore we can all make the world a better place. I want to wish all of the people who tuned in are Jewish what we say, an easy fast and a true sense of change and renewal tomorrow on Yom Kippur. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I can't wait to be able to stay in contact with you over email. If you have any questions, if you ever want to talk to me, I'm always available. This is Adina Stilerman and Sarah Montana signing off from what was an incredibly enjoyable evening for me.
Me too. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.